I'm 67 years old, and I never thought I'd be sitting in my own kitchen in Kelowna, shaking with a split lip and a bruised wrist, waiting for the RCMP to arrive at my daughter's house 2 streets over. But what my son-in-law didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had spent the previous 3 weeks quietly, carefully, making sure that when this moment came, I would still be standing. And they would not. Let me go back to the beginning. Because it didn't start with a punch. It started with a moving box. My name is Dorothy, and I spent 32 years working as a notarial officer for a law firm in downtown Kelowna. I reviewed documents for a living. I caught errors that lawyers missed. I knew what a forged signature looked like before I could see the whole page. When I retired at 64, my colleagues joked that I'd be bald within a month. They were right, in a way. But I filled the quiet with my garden, my weekly book club at the library branch on Ellis Street, and my 2 cats, both named after British prime ministers. I was content, not happy, in the loud, effortful way that people perform on social media, but genuinely, quietly content. I had a condo I'd owned outright since my divorce. I had my RRSP, my pension from the firm, and a small rental property outside of Penticton that had been in my family since my father's time. I did not need anyone's help. I did not need to be taken care of. When my daughter Sylvia called last spring and said she missed me, said she wanted me closer, said the drive from Kelowna to their place in West Kelowna was too long for someone my age. I should have noticed the word, someone my age. I was 66 then. I drove myself to yoga twice a week, but I heard what I wanted to hear, which was that my daughter missed me, and I packed a bag. Sylvia had always been the complicated one. She'd moved fast through life, married young, had her son Aidan before she was 30, and then met her second husband, Kevin, at a work conference in Calgary. Kevin was the kind of man who wore watches that cost more than my car, and talked about opportunity the way a preacher talks about salvation. I was polite to him because Sylvia loved him, and because Aidan seemed to like him, and because I had learned, after my own divorce, that no one wins when you say out loud what you actually think about your daughter's husband. They had a nice house. I'll give them that. 4 bedrooms on a quiet street near Mission Hill with a view of the lake that genuinely took your breath away. Sylvia had set up the guest room with new linens, a small reading chair, and a framed photo of the 2 of us from her sister's wedding. I stood in the doorway with my suitcase and thought, maybe I've been holding this family at arm's length for too long. Maybe this is the repair I didn't know we needed. The first week felt real. Sylvia made dinner most nights. Kevin asked me about my work at the firm, seemed genuinely curious. Aidan, who was 12 now, and going through that stage where grandmothers are embarrassing by proximity, still sat beside me on the couch when he thought no one was watching. I let myself relax. I let myself think that coming here had been the right thing. Then the small things started. The first was the envelope. Kevin left it on the kitchen counter one Tuesday morning. A pamphlet from a financial planning firm called Hartwell Group, paper-clipped to a handwritten note. Thought this might be useful as you settle in. He said nothing about it at breakfast, just poured his coffee and scrolled through his phone. I read the pamphlet in my room later. It was about consolidating assets in retirement. Simplifying, the cover said, building a legacy for the people you love. I put it in my recycling bin and didn't mention it. The second thing was subtler. Sylvia started bringing up money in conversation, never directly. Never in a way you could call aggressive. She mentioned that Kevin's firm had had a rough quarter. She mentioned that Aidan's tuition for private school had gone up again. She mentioned, once, that they were thinking of refinancing the mortgage and that it would be so much smoother if the whole family was on the same page financially. I nodded and changed the subject. But later that night, I lay in the dark guest room with the lake glittering below the window, and I counted how many times she'd used the word family in the past week where she meant money. By the end of the second week, Kevin asked me to dinner alone. Sylvia was at a PTA meeting. He made pasta, actually made it, not from a box, and poured wine and was warm and relaxed and funny, and I remember thinking, this is a performance. I'd spent 32 years watching people perform reasonableness on paper. I recognized it in person. Over dinner, he brought up what he called a straightforward arrangement. He had access to an investment vehicle, not speculative, he said, very stable, a real asset fund with properties across the Okanagan. He said if I were to move some of my RRSP into it, I'd see better returns than I was getting from my current portfolio and the family would benefit from the compounding. He said family again. He said I could speak to his accountant any time. I said I'd think about it. He smiled like that meant yes. That night I called my financial advisor, Patricia, from my car parked in their driveway. I kept the engine running so Sylvia wouldn't see the light from my phone in the window. I told Patricia about the fund. She looked it up while I waited. Dorothy, she said after a moment, this vehicle is registered to a numbered company in Alberta. I can't find Hartwell Group in any provincial securities registry. Don't sign anything. I didn't sleep well after that. Not because I was afraid. Not yet. But because something had cracked open in my chest that I hadn't wanted to look at. I had come here believing my daughter missed me, and she might have. But there was another reason I'd been invited, and it had nothing to do with the view of the lake. I started being careful in ways I hadn't been before. I changed the passwords on my bank accounts and my CRA, my account. I called my notary, a woman named Jean, who had been a colleague of mine for years, and asked her to review my existing power of attorney documents and flag anything that could be altered without my explicit presence. She asked if everything was all right. It's a precaution, I told her. I've been reviewing some paperwork that doesn't look right. Jean didn't push. She got it done. I started keeping a small notebook in my cardigan pocket. Dates, times, conversations. What Kevin said at dinner Wednesday. What Sylvia left on the counter Friday. The look they exchanged when I said I wasn't ready to talk about account consolidation. I'd kept notes like this for clients for 3 decades. It was second nature. What felt unnatural was having to do it in my own family. The 3rd week was when the documents appeared. Sylvia brought them to my room on a Sunday afternoon, while Kevin took Aidan to hockey practice. She sat on the edge of the reading chair and held out a folder in that careful way she had when she was asking for something she already knew I might say no to. Shoulders forward, voice light. All the practiced warmth of someone who'd grown up watching me be patient with difficult people. "Mum," she said, "Kevin's accountant put this together. It's just a draft, nothing final. It's about making sure your assets are protected if anything were to happen." She opened the folder. Inside was a power of attorney document with Kevin listed as the sole authorized agent. Not Sylvia, not my other daughter, Brenda, who lived in Halifax and had no idea any of this was happening. Kevin alone, with access to all accounts, all property, all financial decisions. I looked at the page for a long time. I did not look at Sylvia. Then I said, quietly, that I'd need time to review it with my own notary before signing anything. Sylvia's voice shifted, just slightly. She said Jean was retired, wasn't she? Not entirely up to date on current practice. I said Jean was actively practicing and that I would be in touch with her this week. I handed the folder back. Sylvia took it without comment. She went downstairs. I heard her call Kevin before his car was even in the driveway. That night, I found my laptop had been moved. I kept it on the left side of the desk, charger tucked under the corner. It was on the right side, cord pulled out. I opened it. My browser history had been cleared. I hadn't cleared it. The next morning, I drove to John's office. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is something very few people know how to do. When I finished, she said, "Dorothy, I want you to understand that what you're describing constitutes elder financial abuse under the criminal code. We need to document this properly." She walked me through the process of placing a fraud alert with my 2 main financial institutions, adding a secondary verification step to my CRA account, and reviewing the title on the Penticton property to confirm no changes had been attempted. The property title was clean, but Jean found something else. An inquiry had been made to the Land Title Office 3 weeks ago, just before I'd moved in, requesting a copy of the ownership record on the Penticton lot. The inquiry was filed under a business name, Hartwell Group. I sat in Jean's office and felt the full shape of it for the first time. This had been planned before I arrived. The guest room with the new linens, the framed photo from the wedding, Sylvia saying she missed me. It was all architecture, a room built to soften me up. I drove back to the house and made dinner as if nothing had happened. I talked about the book club. I asked Aidan about his math test. Kevin was charming and attentive and poured my wine first. I smiled. I had already called Brenda from the parking lot outside Jean's office and told her everything. Brenda, who had always been practical and unsentimental and absolutely furious on my behalf, had already called her own lawyer in Halifax and was looking into flights. I didn't tell Sylvia any of this. Not yet. The 4th week was the worst. I found my filing pouch. The small leather one I kept in my suitcase with copies of my property deed, my will, and my insurance documents, on the dresser instead of inside the bag where I'd zipped it. The will was there. The insurance document was there. The property deed was gone. I sat on the bed for several minutes. Then I went downstairs. Kevin was at the kitchen table with his laptop. Sylvia was making coffee with her back to me. I said, very evenly, that something was missing from my room. Kevin looked up with that smooth, concerned expression he had for inconvenient moments. "Maybe you misplaced it," he said. "You know how things get when you're settling into a new space." Sylvia didn't turn around. I said I didn't misplace it. I said I kept that document in a specific place for a specific reason, and it was gone. Kevin said gently that maybe I was tired and should sit down. That's when I knew I'd underestimated the timeline. They weren't waiting for me to sign anything. They were already moving. I went back upstairs, closed my door, and used my cell phone, not the house Wi-Fi, to call Patricia again. I told her about the deed. She told me to contact the land title office first thing in the morning to request an official owner status certificate and to place a restriction on any changes to the title without my in-person authorization. Then I called Jean. She said she would reach out to the RCMP detachment in West Kelowna and ask about the process for documenting this kind of case before it escalated. Before it escalated. Before it escalated. That phrase stayed with me, because I had spent 30 years knowing that people don't escalate evenly. They go quiet, then they go fast. 2 days later, I told Sylvia I was going to stay with a friend in Summerland for a few days. I needed a break. She asked which friend. I said Meredith, which was true, and gave her no other information. Kevin was in the hallway and said nothing. I packed a bag. Just the essentials, my medications, my notebook, the backup flash drive I'd been using since the laptop incident, and I drove to Summerland. Meredith had been my closest friend since our children were in primary school together. She met me at the door, looked at my face, and didn't ask any questions. She just made tea. From Meredith's kitchen table, I spent 2 evenings reorganizing everything. I consolidated my liquid accounts into a structure Jean had helped me set up, a Henson trust model. Not technically the right instrument for my situation, but Jean knew a trust specialist in Kelowna who moved quickly. I transferred the registered accounts to a new institution. I sent notarized copies of all key documents to Brenda in Halifax and to a safety deposit box at the branch on Pandosi Street that Kevin had no knowledge of. I called the land title office and placed the restriction on the Penticton property title. I was not running. I was preparing. I went back to Sylvia's house because I had things there that mattered to me. My mother's jewelry box. The photo albums from when the girls were small. A small wooden carving my father had made that had been sitting on every windowsill in every house I'd ever lived in. I had called Sylvia before I left Summerland and told her I'd be back to collect some things. She said, "Fine." She said she'd been worried about me. Her voice was careful in a way that made my stomach turn. I arrived in the early evening. Kevin's car was in the driveway. I had hoped he'd be out. I went upstairs quietly and packed quickly. The photo albums, the jewelry box, my father's carving, a few books. I was zipping the bag when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Not Sylvia's, heavier. Kevin appeared in the doorway. He looked at the bag and at me, and the charm fell off his face completely. He said, "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I said I was collecting my belongings. He said I wasn't going anywhere until we had a conversation about the property transfer and about how I had gone and, as he put it, frozen up the assets that were supposed to help this family. He stepped into the room. His voice was still controlled, but his eyes were not. I said I didn't owe him any conversation about my property. He said I'd made things very difficult for Sylvia, who had sacrificed to have me here, who had bent over backward, who deserved better than a mother who spent her time sneaking around behind their backs. He stepped closer. I held the bag in front of me. That's when Sylvia came to the door. She stood just behind him, arms crossed, her face doing the same complicated thing it had done in that armchair when she'd handed me the folder. Half angry, half uncertain. Kevin turned to her and said, Tell her she's being unreasonable. Tell her what we've done for her." Sylvia looked at me. Something moved across her face that I hadn't seen in years, something that looked like her at 12, not sure who to believe. Then she said, "Mom, why can't you just trust us?" I said, "Sylvia, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I need you to look at what Kevin is asking you to do. Look at those documents. His name, not yours, not mine, just his." Kevin's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, hard, the way someone does when they're done talking. I tried to pull back. He shoved me against the dresser. The corner caught my lip. I felt the split before I felt the pain. I kept my feet. I did not fall. I looked at Sylvia, who had gone completely still. I said, very clearly, "I am calling 911 now." Kevin said I had better think about that. Sylvia said nothing. I walked past both of them, down the stairs and out the front door. I sat in my car on the street with my phone in my hand and my lip bleeding onto my collar, and I called 911. The dispatcher was calm. She kept me on the line. I told her I had been assaulted and I gave her the address. She told me officers were on their way. While I waited, I sent one text to Jean, "It happened. Police coming," and one to Brenda, who called me back in 45 seconds flat. The officers arrived in under 10 minutes, two of them, a woman named Constable Parrish and her partner. She came to my window first and took one look at my face and said, "Mom, can you step out of the vehicle?" She was steady and professional, and she didn't once ask me if I was confused or if I'd perhaps misunderstood. She wrote everything down. She asked if there were others in the house. She said an ambulance was coming. In the back of the ambulance, a paramedic closed the cut on my lip. The social worker at Kelowna General was named Daisy, early 40s. Direct, no unnecessary softness. She asked clear questions, and I gave clear answers. I handed her the notebook from my cardigan pocket, 31 days of dates and times, and specific words. She looked at it and said, "You kept this from the beginning." I said yes. She said that was going to matter. It did matter. Kevin was taken in for questioning that night. The RCMP Financial Crime Unit was contacted when Jean provided documentation of the Hartwell Group land title inquiry and the fraudulent fund structure. By the time Brenda landed at Kelowna Airport the next afternoon, a fraud investigation had been formally opened. It turned out Hartwell Group was connected to two other complaints. One in Kamloops, one in the Comox Valley, both involving elderly property owners, both involving Kevin's name in association with different company fronts. He had done this before. Sylvia called me from the driveway of their house the morning after Kevin's arrest. I could hear her crying before she finished saying my name. She didn't try to explain or justify. She just said, "Mom, I didn't know about the other people." She said she thought it was just about money, just about their financial situation. She told herself that eventually I would have agreed, that Kevin was just being practical. She said she knew that was wrong. She said it as a statement, not a question. I didn't tell her I forgave her. That wasn't the right word for where I was. But I told her I would see her when she was ready to talk, and I meant it. She was still my daughter. She had been manipulated by a man who had made an art form of making manipulation feel like love. I knew that. I also knew she would need to reckon with her own choices, and that reckoning was hers to do, not mine to carry. I stayed at Meredith's for 6 weeks while the investigation proceeded. Kevin's lawyer tried to characterize me as confused, elderly, prone to paranoia. The fraud unit asked me to come in twice for detailed interviews. Both times I brought my notebook, my documentation binder, and the backup drive. The case officer, a woman named Sergeant Tremblay with close-cropped grey hair and no patience for nonsense, told me I had built a more complete evidence file than most trained investigators would have managed. I told her I used to do this for a living. She almost smiled. By the time the spring thaw came, Kevin had been charged with fraud over $5,000, identity misrepresentation, and criminal harassment. The Penticton property was fully protected. My accounts were intact. The trust structure Jean had helped me build was clean and ironclad and named Brenda a successor trustee, with Sylvia listed as a future beneficiary contingent on a period of independent living and financial counseling. My condition, my peace. Sylvia filed for divorce in March. She and Aidan moved into a rental in Kelowna, 2 blocks from the library where she'd gone for story time when she was 3 years old. I drove over on a Saturday with a casserole and a box of old photos, and we sat at her kitchen table for 4 hours and talked in a way we hadn't since she was young. Honestly, without the layer of performance that Kevin had installed between us like a pane of glass. Aidan came in from school in the middle of it and sat down without being asked. He put his backpack on the floor and looked at us both. "Are you guys okay?" he said. We told him yes. He said good, and opened a bag of chips, and that was that. I moved back into my condo in Kelowna in April. The cats, Churchill and Trudeau, because I like a little irony in my household, had been at Meredith's and were deeply unimpressed by the transition back. The garden needed work. The book club had missed me. Life restarted in the way it does, not with a dramatic moment, but with ordinary things. Groceries and deadheading the roses, and a phone call to Patricia to review the new account structure. One evening in May, a Daisy, the social worker from the hospital, called to ask if I'd be willing to speak at a session they were putting together for community health workers on recognizing financial elder abuse. Not a courtroom, not a press release, just a room with people who wanted to understand the patterns better so they could see them sooner. I said yes, because the thing I didn't understand before all of this was how quietly it happens. There's no dramatic moment when you suddenly realize your family has turned into a trap. It's a receipt left on the counter. It's a word choice. It's a door opened that you left closed. It accumulates, and by the time it's undeniable, you've been doubting your own clarity for weeks. That's by design. That's the whole point. I was a notarial officer for 32 years. I had the professional reflex to document. Most people don't. Most people sit in their guest rooms with the beautiful view of the lake and tell themselves they must have misplaced the deed. That's the part I think about. Not the punch, not the bruise, not Kevin's face in the doorway. I think about the women who don't have 30 years of document review behind them, who don't have a Jean or a Patricia, who do fall for the story about legacy and family and what's yours is ours, and I'm only trying to help. I think about them when I water my garden in the early morning and the light comes off the lake in that particular way it does in Kelowna in the spring, low and gold and slightly unreal. I think I got to keep this. I almost didn't. And I think about what I would want someone to say to them if they're sitting somewhere right now with a folder in front of them that doesn't feel right. Trust that feeling. Document everything. Call someone who is only on your side. You are not confused. You are not difficult. You are not asking too much by wanting what is yours to stay yours. You are, like me, simply paying attention. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the shove, not the split lip, not Kevin's face when the officers came to the door. It's earlier than that. It's the Tuesday morning I stood at the kitchen counter reading a pamphlet about consolidating assets in retirement, and something in my chest said, "This is not right." I almost talked myself out of it. I almost decided I was being uncharitable, suspicious, difficult. I almost chose peace over clarity. I didn't. And that choice is the whole story, really. What happened to me didn't come out of nowhere. Kevin didn't wake up one morning and decide to defraud an elderly woman he'd known for 6 years. He had done it before. He had a pattern. a method, a type. He chose people who might hesitate to cause trouble, who might second-guess their own instincts, who loved someone he had access to. He chose people like me, and he nearly succeeded, because I wanted to believe my daughter had invited me into her home out of love. That wanting made me slow. It made me generous with explanations I shouldn't have been generous with. The pamphlet, the moved laptop, the deed that vanished from my own bag. I explained each one away for a day or two before I wrote it down. Writing it down is what saved me. Not because documentation is magic, but because it's the first honest thing you can do when you're not sure what's real. You put the date and the time and the specific words, and you look at them the next morning, and they don't change. They don't soften. That's how I knew. I think about Sylvia a lot still. She's doing the work now, the therapy, the rebuilding, the long, uncomfortable process of understanding how she got there. She was not a villain in this. She was a woman who had been slowly persuaded that her mother's caution was selfishness, that her husband's greed was practicality, that loyalty to family meant going along with something she knew somewhere was wrong. She knew. I saw it in her face when she handed me that folder. The knowing was there. She just hadn't found the courage to trust it yet. I don't say that to excuse what she did. I say it because I think honesty requires holding both things at once, that she caused real harm and that she was also being harmed. What Brenda said to me, the week it all came out, was, "Mom, Sylvia is going to need to figure out who she is without him." I think that's right. And I think it's something only she can do. As for me, I'm 67 and I live in my own condo and I water my garden in the morning and I go to book club on Thursdays, and none of that is small. I built a life that was worth protecting. I had the presence of mind to protect it. And when the moment came that required more than presence of mind, when Kevin's hand came down on my wrist and I had to decide in that second whether I was going to be frightened or clear, I was clear. That's the thing I want to say, if any of this sounds familiar to you. The clarity was not a gift I was born with. It was 32 years of paying attention. It was choosing, again and again, to trust what I observed over what I wished were true. It was keeping the notebook even when I felt foolish doing it. It was calling Patricia from a parking lot in the dark because I couldn't make that call inside the house. You don't need a professional background to do what I did. You need to take your own discomfort seriously. You need to ask someone who is only on your side. You need to understand that what belongs to you, the work of your life, the property your father left you, the savings you built through decades of careful choices, is worth the discomfort of saying no. Kevin is facing charges. The investigation is ongoing. I don't spend much energy thinking about what happens to him. I spend it on Sylvia and on Aidan and on the women I've met since who are sitting somewhere with a folder in front of them that doesn't feel right. I hope they trust that feeling. I hope they pick up a pen